In 2010, my editor sent me a book. It was by someone called Evie Wyld, and it was called After the Fire, A Still Small Voice. It rather had me at the title, which seemed so pregnant with implication. All I knew about the author was that she was a Londoner. Imagine my surprise when I opened it and read an extraordinary story of 3 generations of an Australian family and the trauma that they suffer as a result of war. The setting was Australian and, quite frankly, a more eidetically correct, a more photographically recalled portrait of the Australia I knew than many Australian authors born and bred here could have ventured. I wrote a rave review, which I cannot find online. Google has eaten the review, but let it to be said, you can find my review of All the Birds Singing, which is the most recent book by Evie Wyld. And some of you may know she won a little prize called the Miles Franklin. Evie has won a pile of other prizes that you may not understand the import of, but they are significant. She has also been named on the Granta Best Young Novelist list, which is pretty much the definitive portrait shot of a generation of up-and-coming writers in the Anglosphere, and particularly in the UK. She has very graciously come to Australia. Probably your publicist just tied you up and dragged you here. But she's come here with a 5-month-old baby. So this is how hard, who you will be glad to know is not in the audience with us today. Evie, could we start by just having you give us a brief read from All the Birds Singing? Because I think you need to get a sense of the texture of Evie's prose to really understand the place, the quite dark place, the dark and beautiful place she's coming from.
Lovely. So I'm going to read just from the beginning and just a page or so. For anyone who hasn't read it, it's about a woman called Jake living on a small unnamed island in the UK, and something's killing her sheep. Another sheep, mangled and bled out, her innards not yet crusting, and the vapours rising from her like a steamed pudding. Crows, their beaks shining, strutting and rasping, and when I waved my stick, they flew to the trees and watched, flaring out their wings, singing, if you could call it that. I shoved my boot in Dog's face to stop him from taking a string of her away with him as a souvenir, and he kept close by my side as I wheeled the carcass out of the field and down into the woolshed. I'd been up that morning before the light came through, out there talking to myself, telling the dog about the things that needed doing as the blackbirds in the hawthorn started up. Like a mad woman listening to her own voice, the wind shoving it back down my throat and hooting over my open mouth like it had done every morning since I moved to the island. With the trees rattling in the copse and the sheep blaring out behind me, the same trees, the same wind and sheep. That made 2 deaths in a month. The rain started to come down, and a sudden gust of wind flung sheep shit at the back of my neck so it stung. I pulled up my collar and shielded my eyes with my hand. Cree, cra, cold. Cree, cra, cold. What are you laughing at? I shouted at the crows and lobbed a stone at them. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and breathed in and out heavily to get rid of the blood smell. The crows were silent. When I turned to look, 5 of them sat in a row on the same branch, eyeing me but not speaking. The wind blew my hair in my eyes. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Now, as part of my research for today's session, I was watching Eurovision in a coffee shop this morning. And I saw a glimpse of Georgia performing. And Georgia's entrant was a kind of goth princess. She was in kind of thigh-high boots and wearing feathers and had an alarmingly kind of coal-rimmed eyes, and she looked shouty.
Very good.
And it occurred to me that the Gothic as a genre, as a form, as a cultural force, inaugurated hundreds of years ago with figures such as William Beckford, had found its final resting place as a kind of bit of high cultural camp at a music competition. And yet, for me, that opening is pure Gothic. I wanted to ask you about Gothic as a form, whether this is one you've consciously operated in, and if so, how do you manage to do what you do, which is, as far as I'm concerned, re-infuse the Gothic with a bit of its original terror?
Thank you. I suppose how I do it is by not really knowing all that much about the Gothic. I started out writing All the Birds, and I wanted to write something frightening, and I'm a big fan of horror. And what I wanted to do was sort of take the sort of horror movies that I really love and not give them that disappointing quarter where they show you the monster. I wanted to sort of live with the, like the family ghost stories, which you don't get closure on. They're just like, so my friend's mother tells this story that she was, as a kid, playing hide and seek in her parents' house, and she opened up a chest at the bottom of their bed and found a very old man curled up inside who went, shh. And she closed the lid and went and hid somewhere else. And that's the whole story. There's no, and he was there to warn her, and he was there to attack her. It was just a creepy old man in a chest. And to me,
Is she okay?
she's fine. She went on to, be a doctor. It was all good. But I think the thing that really interests me about horror and about ghosts is, being an atheist, I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe that people see them, and that makes me fascinated in them. One of my favourite sort of hangover cures is to watch clips of people, and it's usually Americans who go on these shows, and they're kind of saying, oh, there was this terrible bang, and then my wife was pushed down the stairs, and the husband sat next to the wife going, it was a ghost, and you're like, was it? There's there's something really nice, and the stories that are behind the ghost stories, and also when people genuinely think they've seen something, what that means about their brain and what they need to see, and the hidden crevices of our brains that we don't know about, that we don't use.
Well, the English eerie has had a bit of a renaissance in recent years, and I noticed a piece by the nature writer Robert Macfarlane in The Guardian a few weeks back arguing that all of these spectral histories are starting to emerge from British ground after many years of kind of, the bright lights of modernity seeming to keep them at bay. But you don't strike me as working in that English tradition. You're interested in the Australian eerie. So there's something about Australian horror movies, isn't it? If they get it right, there's something uniquely terrifying. And I'm not thinking of sort of, howling for the marsupials, but I'm thinking of those films like, say, Wake in Fright, which I regard as a horror movie, seems to draw some sustenance from Australian conditions. Now, the island where Jake White has washed up does not exist. I spent a lot of time on Google Maps trying to work out where it might be. It's not there, it's invented. And you are actually quite vague about the UK landscape that she moves through. Australia, however, Port Hedland, the Pilbara, all of those locales in the book are drawn with such rigour. I wondered why it is that somebody who spent intermittent trips in her childhood to Australia would have stuck so much material so fast in her memory, and why she feels it's uniquely designed for your brand of Gothic horror.
I think, the landscape of Australia has always been one for me that's been full of ghosts, and it's been quite bloody. I mean, the UK is as well. I mean, we're the people who sent out the people to make the blood. So for me, my grandfather on the East Coast used to tell me lots of ghost stories, and he's a sugarcane farmer, and there's all this, massive sea of cane, and as a child I'd walk around it really happily and enjoy myself making up stories and playing and stuff. And then there was this one little bit of marshland where he said there was a yowie, and that it was a woman who'd had her legs cut off, as you do to a 6-year-old child. And that when you heard the cane rustling...
You knew some interesting people.
When you heard the cane rustling, that was her dragging herself towards you. But it never stopped me going through there, It became like a kind of, right, I've got to the yowie point and it's time to walk through it, and what's going to happen and what do you see. And they also had, so they're farm people, and they go hunting a lot. They bring back goats and pigs and things, foxes. And what they do with the carcasses is they leave them out in the bush for the sea eagles to eat. And then once they've been picked clean, my uncle goes and hangs the head on the tree. So you'll be walking through and you'll see skulls looking at you of all different shapes and sizes, all different heights and stuff. So, that's sort of an example of the stock I come from.
So I'm so surprised. So surprised that this stuff stayed with you. But it's not just this kind of extreme gothic bush vocabulary that you're employing. You're also fantastic on Australian soap operas of the mid-1980s, on cigarette brands, on lollies, on dodgy expressions that were used about the time that there were big weddings on Neighbours that everybody watched. Why do you think that this particular moment has stayed with you, this milieu, this language?
I think I was quite a sickly child, and I was incredibly shy. So I didn't speak much. I was really in awe of my uncle and my grandfather, who are these loud, funny people and strong, and they're the kind of Australian to wear underwear but no shoes, to drive their tractors around, and I think my uncle has a rule. I don't know if he still abides by it, that you wear shoes to a funeral but not a wedding. So, they were kind of these huge, colourful characters, and I've come from my own father, who was colourful in his own way, but very, very British, and his life was about fine wines and, good conversation, and he preferred the company of women, and it was kind of a very different aspect of masculinity for me. And so I think I spent a lot of the time just in awe as a very small girl, just watching and soaking it up. And when we weren't in Australia, I pined for it so much that I would dream about it and think about it. And, stories I wrote when I was a kid were all like, I was in Australia and I once gave, at primary school, we had to give a talk on something, and I gave my talk on sharks, and it lasted the whole period, and I wouldn't sit down. I was just like going through a book going, and there's this shark and this shark. And it just, to me, it was like collecting memories meant I was closer to the place, I think.
It's interesting what you say about Australian masculinity and your, I get a sense of mingled awe and horror as they're expressed through the books, rather than what you're saying about your magnificent family.
Magnificent. I like
that. The world of Australian masculinity seems to me to be absolutely central to your project across these two books. Mm-hmm. It's very much front and centre. It's much more gently, I think, and sympathetically treated in your first book, and treated with full-on, violence and horror in your second. But it seemed to me that Australian masculinity seemed to have some special flavour or power or unreconstructed material that you found very amenable. And I wondered if your interest in Australia was in part because you thought that this might be more thematically powerful for your means.
I'm not sure that I thought about it that closely when I started writing, but I mean, there's definitely something there. Again, the contrast between British masculinity, which is quiet and, you know, stiff upper lip and all of that stuff, and thin and pale, and this sort of the idea that you can it feels to me much more like you can have a man in a landscape on their own, kind of living off the land, which is what my uncle sort of does. He sort of fishes out the sea and picks stuff and all that sort of business. So I think for me it's an interest in that, and the reason that I write to begin with is to try and understand people a bit more. So maybe it's sort of a yearning to understand my Australian roots, perhaps, which you know, I have some incredible female characters in my family as well, but because of how life is, the male strand of my family sort of loom larger, I suppose. And I think it's always about me trying to get back and close to the feeling I had about Australia when I was a kid.
Now, the reason I'm pressing the button of gender so hard is because what you need to know about Jake White, the character at the beginning of All the Birds Singing, is that Jake is a she. Jake is a former contract shearer based in Australia, Australian-born, whose history is one of... I'm not going to go into it. It's an enormous plot spoiler. Let's just say that as tough lives go, she's had about the toughest. But throughout the book, she's described as broad-shouldered. The men call her mate. Being a rouseabout is no mean feat for a young man, let alone a young woman in those homosocial worlds of the shearing shed. Can you tell us a little bit about why the character at the heart of this wonderful novel is so ambiguous in terms of her gender?
It's a funny thing. I mean, the whole sheep thing and being rouseabout and then a shearer, it kind of came very organically in that the sheep weren't there to begin with. She wasn't a shearer to start with. I, in fact, sort of went to great pains to keep sheep out of the book because I didn't know anything about them. And
they just crept back
They
in.
just... they are sinister animals. Have you ever walked into a field of sheep at night and you shine your torch and it's just like crocodiles looking back at you? But so eventually the places that Jake was showing up in both Australia and the UK, and her broad shoulders and her strength, that was all there before I had her down as a shearer or anything to do with that. And it gradually insisted itself, like, if she's in these places, this is what she's doing. And for me, it's always interesting to put a character at the kind of sort of limit of comfort, or the limit of what would have been the limit of my comfort, you know, sort of popping her in situations where she has to adapt and either run away or adapt and become someone else. So I think living with all the shearers, she gives herself a new personality. She just leaves behind everything that's happened to her and is that person in that moment. And unfortunately for her, it doesn't work out because things catch up. And that's really interesting to me, the idea of running from your problems rather than, you know, doing whatever you can do to deal with them. I don't know what she could have done different, really.
It's not fair, really, is it?
No.
Which brings me to questions of narrative machinery and plot and chronology. Those of you who have read All the Birds Singing will know that it's a dazzlingly complex time scheme that Evie is juggling. All of these recursive swoops back and back in time. So we meet Jake in the present, or somewhere near the present, on this island with her sheep and her dog named Dog. And then only slowly move backwards in time to understand that she was once an Australian woman working in a shearing shed, and before that there was another layer to her life, and before that another. And it actually ends really with her origin story. Why make an already very dramatic book in terms of its just mimetic content, what happens, sex, violence, death, animality. Why this dazzling complexity of scheme? Is it just something that you just love messing with the reader's head, or is it technical fun for you as a writer to actually make these puzzle boxes?
It is a lot of fun. There's I think so much of writing a novel is about play and about working out, how something, like with colours, so orange and blue next door to each other look different to blue and green. And you can do that with a structure, that you put two things next to each other that don't belong. And there's a whole other space that opens up, and that the reader will bring, their own experience to. And for me, structure is a chance to sort of leave gulfs that you fill with your own stuff. And that is really, really exciting for me as a reader and a writer. It's about my experience of reading the novel or writing the novel, which is just as relevant as, a furious email I get from someone going, but what did happen at the end?
Spoiler alert, you don't actually find out.
So you get or you do, or a lot of people know exactly what happened at the end. And that to me is fascinating, and wasn't entirely, it's not like I wrote it and was entirely aware of what I was doing. I was playing and stuff came out of that. But to me, structure is definitely one of the great joys of writing something large, is you can do weird stuff. And I wouldn't necessarily do that structure for anything else. And it didn't look like that until quite late in the writing. And it also meant that I had to take out large chunks because they didn't fit within the framework that I decided on. So it's quite a tricky thing, and it's quite a good method of editing. If you force yourself, if you limit your palette, your colour palette, you find ways of tightening up the writing.
I think what you're telling us betrays a certain amount of knowledge of your craft. You studied, presumably, creative writing at Goldsmiths. And as a bookseller, and you've said you're a bookseller first and a novelist a second, I'm sure that's slowly changing, but that struck me as being someone saying that they're a reader first prior to being an author. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about those books that have operated as touchstones for you, as kind of as a technician and as someone who simply just loves the power of story.
Well, Tim Winton is not all that left field for me to say that I'm a big fan of his. I read Cloud Street when I was about 13 and just became sort of amazed by the characters, really. I wanted him to write a sequel to it, and I assumed that he had those people in his head carrying on their lives. It doesn't work like that, sadly, and also thank God. But then the book with my first book, when I was figuring out how to write a novel and how many words do you have to do this amount of work in and all that sort of thing, I would reread his book, The Riders, and just literally go, he's done that in a sentence, how has he done that? So for kind of teaching, I kind of use him quite a lot. And then for sort of broad scope stuff that makes me really excited about structure and about the role of fiction and non-fiction within a fictional novel, I was looking at Let Us Now Praise Famous Men.
James R.G.
Yeah, I love that book. It is one of the most boring books in places that you will ever read, and it's hard and it makes your eyes bleed.
We should explain that this is a work of very poetic non-fiction in which the great American photographer Walker Evans and Times film critic James R.G., who is also a wonderful novelist and non-fiction writer, travelled through the Dust Bowl and wrote an account of the people that they met and the human extremity of that particular period of the Great Depression.
Yeah, that's good summing up. And it started out as, it was supposed to be a magazine piece, and it turned into this, so it's like 400-page thing. And it's impenetrable. And, you know, there are scenes where he describes every little thing in this tiny little bald shack. And it's really, really hard, but I think it's wonderful. So, and then growing up, I read a lot of Angela Carter's, a lot of fairy tales. And I do read mainly now contemporary fiction because of working in the bookshop. And I recently read 4th of July Creek by Smith Henderson, which I really recommend. Brilliant.
I've got it on the desk. I will have a look. Thank you. Now, you have dual citizenship, but in reality, you're a Londoner who spent extended periods of time here. Your mum was Australian.
Yep.
And yet, I've already mentioned the kind of clarity you bring both to Australian life in all its phases, as Miles Franklin has it, and to Australian masculinity. And it reminded me that our great film of the dark side of Australian masculinity is Wake in Fright, from the novel. And its director was Ted Kotcheff. And Ted Kotcheff was Canadian. So a great Australian film directed by a Canadian. I wondered to what degree being an outsider with some knowledge of the culture you're writing about is helpful to a certain clarity of gaze.
Yeah, I think, I certainly found the parts of All the Birds set in the UK much harder to pinpoint, and that's partly because if you're sat in a landscape, you're just concerned with getting what you've got on the paper exactly right and exactly like what's in front of you. And I think that having a bit of nostalgia for Australia and having my childhood memories and smells and, you know, the sort of smell bank that I have of the sugarcane farm in particular is so strong and so specific, and it doesn't kind of, I think it's stronger because it's not like that anymore. You know, I haven't been there to see the farm change in so many different ways slowly. For me, it's still the same place that it was when I was 11 or something. So it definitely clicks into my imagination more than the place that I see every day and all the time. And yeah, I think that the British landscape has, although I live in London, so the countryside is slightly an unknown place to me. In the UK, it's got a melancholy and a gothic feel that is very, very different to Australia. And I think just again, it all comes down to contrast. When I'm sitting in Peckham and it's raining and it's cold, I think about those kind of deserty spaces or the Pacific Ocean, or I just think about the other, really.
It's interesting you say that. You think about early V.S. Naipaul sitting not far from you in Peckham, looking at the rain and putting his Russell-free BBC typewriter paper in and reimagining the tropical glories of, his home back in Trinidad. So I think that sense of recall is obviously, very clear.
I think it also, you're able to follow your imagination more if you're not bothered about, is this exactly what it looks like?
Too much reality around you, I guess,
exactly.
in your home culture. Now, as I said earlier on, Evie's come over with her husband and 5-month-old baby. And she actually, when she was awarded the Miles Franklin, she couldn't even have a drink because she was heavily pregnant. And it occurs to me that someone who writes in the mode that you do, who explores such extreme psychological states, who goes places where other writers fear to tread, that the experience of having a child might change you. But in the broader sense, how right was Cyril Connolly when he said, "The pram in the hall, the enemy of all sombre good art"?
It just makes me think of Rosemary's Baby. I know that Ian McEwan talked about after he'd had kids, he found it very hard to go back to the darkness that the cement garden, and child death suddenly gets a bit tricky, which is a good thing, I think, probably. I think I'll always write about the darker things. It might take me a little bit longer, but I certainly don't have that feeling of like, right, well now people always used to really drive me nuts. People would always say to me, well, writing a novel, giving a novel over, it's very much like having a baby, isn't it? And I was just like, I have no reference point for that, so maybe. It's not anything like that. It turns out.
That's why guys write novels, because we're jealous of childbirth.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's part of life, and surely adding more parts to your life, more human experience is only a good thing. I can't see it. I can't do anything else to any sort of satisfactory degree. So,
well, I was going to say in practical terms, I think we were saying in the green room before, Anne Enright came over here a few years ago for the year that The Gathering won the Booker Prize, and I asked her the same question about the pram in the hall. She said, Cyril Connolly is an idiot. I just have my babies crawling over my lap over the keyboard, it's fine, I knock out a novel every 18 months, etc. But my children who were just coming into the world, when I sat down to try and do that, confident that Anne couldn't be wrong, I discovered that wasn't quite so true.
Yeah.
Has that been true for you?
Not quite yet. I think it will take a bit of time, and that's fine. That's like, I see it as time to creatively recharge. Look at it that way. I've got a graphic novel coming out in August, so hopefully that buys me a little bit of time.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. It's called Everything is Teeth, and I wrote it with an illustrator. And it's about a lot of things we've been talking about today, actually. It's about growing up between London and Australia, and about sharks.
When I read graphic novel in the in an interview, I just thought it meant that there was lots of sex in it. But it's actually
that's the second
drawings.
Yeah, and so it's kind of about it's about my mother feeling homesick for Australia, my father feeling uncomfortable in Australia, and how they moved between the two places. But it's all kind of from my point of view as a small kid, and it's been great fun to do, but it's taken a very long time. So yeah, the editing process when somebody is drawing everything you're talking about rather than just writing it down is slightly longer.
It's an interesting situation for you, isn't it? Because usually what happens after a Miles Franklin win, you get a great deal of pressure locally. I mean, it's friendly, loving pressure, but it's like sit down and write now, or go on tour for 6 months and don't see your family. And that seems inimical to the actual experience of, you sleep-deprived, early motherhood, enjoying your new arrival.
Yeah. No, it definitely wasn't going to work like that. But, I think with with social media, there's a lot of other ways of reaching people, and it's been quite nice to have that win and then kind of just duck out a bit, because it can be incredibly distracting. It's incredibly distracting being published, because you're constantly thinking, oh, that's weird, like it's not just my mum that's read it now. Now, you know, there are people I don't know by any kind of link who have read it. So you've always got your head in the last book. So it's been quite nice to duck out of it and think about the fourth book.
Many of us are here, I know I am, because to some degree it's always wonderful to touch the hem of literary achievement and see how it, you know, if it rubs off. But the notion of success, it seems to me, is very much two-edged. It may be slightly insulating for you that you're not actually here to actually face the music full-time on something like a Miles Franklin win, which has a great deal of cultural capital still, to a place that sees itself in isolated nationalistic terms. But at the same time, success surely has the potential to be paralysing, because you suddenly think, I know that I can do something good, but can I make the leap to the next book?
Yeah, I think that's the second novel, really, right? Like the whole way through, you're just like, well, they liked the first one, that was fine. And you constantly get people saying, well, can you write another one though? And now I'm getting people saying, well, you've done two, but that's the joy of working in a bookshop.
I don't think it ever ends, yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think there's a bigger pressure than the pressure that an author puts on themselves. And, you know, every word I write, you're kind of battling against the sort of evil monkey on the shoulder going, you know, this is rubbish, what are you doing? And you just have to work through that, and that's part of the process, I think, is not, you know, you never get to a point where you feel like, I know how to write a novel. You know, each novel is so different that you're teaching yourself every time. I mean, I say this having written two. I'm assuming that's what happens. So, yeah, I don't think there's any bigger pressure than your own worry of looking like an absolute dick.
Carve that on our tombstones. Right. If you want to understand just how rubbish book reviewers are at picking winners, you can refer to the beginning of my review of Narrow Road to the Deep North. First sentence in which I assert with such stunning, stupid confidence that he's going to win the Miles Franklin that I ate my hat several times later. But I was very glad that Evie should have come through, particularly since Richard's done okay for himself.
He's all right.
Because it seemed to me to crack open, especially in the wake of the lovely Questions of Travel by Michelle de Kretser the year before, this notion that Australian life in all its phases meant an Australian in some incredibly local context, that you fruitfully complicated our idea of what it was to be Australian, and what Australian life was. Is this something you've been conscious of as you've been going forward?
Not really. I think, I mean, the fact that I'm half Australian, half British is sort of so uninteresting to me. I'm not at all patriotic I love Australia and I love London and the countryside in the UK, but I don't feel this pride of, you know, I am an Australian or I am British. It's got nothing to do with me. I was just, I didn't have a say in the matter. I was just sort of plopped out. And and here I am. And it's not, it's funny with the Miles Franklin win. There's obviously a lot of people who are very upset that Richard didn't win. It's a beautiful, wonderful book. And a lot of people sort of tweeting kind of, discomfort, the fact that I wasn't properly Australian. And I sort of wonder if I had the accent, or if I did an accent, if that would make a difference. But yeah, it just is so little to do with me, where I've come from. It becomes sort of, I mean, my husband is half Polish. He's never been there. He doesn't speak the language. I'm half Australian. I loved it as a kid, and I got really involved in it. So he sort of doesn't describe himself often as half Polish, but I always describe myself as half Australian because it feels like it was important to me as an individual, rather than it being a kind of, I don't know, something that you are without having any say.
Well, look, we will open it to questions in a little while, but I just wanted to ask you one more question, although I've got a few in my pocket and I'm greedy. The source culture, home, the UK, how have your books been treated there? How have they been received? And how are you treated? Are you treated as an Anglo, as an Australian, as some third place altogether? Or do those distinctions not really matter in the London context these days?
I think I'm treated as an Australian in London and an English person over here. I think that's what happens.
Well, that just sucks a bit, doesn't it?
It's quite funny. It's just, I do think that the accent is all, like, if I could change my accent when I was over here, I think it would be different, which is just really funny.
And in terms of being able to write about English life, you've talked about the difficulty, the way that the reality sort of it presses in on you and it's hard to evade. But at some point, do you think you might just have to grapple with it and have a go at your Anglo experience? I am. I'm
the next novel that I'm writing is set almost entirely in the UK, but it's in the 1940s, so I don't know. It's not my...
It's another country.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, at this point, the wonders of modern technology, Victoria Murray has actually sent a message to us, and she asks, what made you take that first step to begin your first novel and make the move to get it published? Which, thank you, Victoria, is a question I should have asked right at the beginning. Thank you.
It's a funny thing. I did a creative writing course at Goldsmiths, and I didn't do it to become a writer. I didn't think that was an option. And I did it to get out of a sort of really ropey job that I had, and I needed a reason to leave. Otherwise, I was going to be a manager of a library, not a good library, a library about stroke for the rest of my life. And I could see, you could see that happening. So I thought I should go and study something, and I am terrible at exams. So it was sort of like, I need to do something that requires just coursework, and that really is just something to jump me out of this rubbish job. And creative writing came up. It was either that or photography, I think. And I did it because I thought, well, if I can express myself better on paper, surely that will help for a better job. And then I had a short story published online by the university, and an agent got in touch and said, so you write short stories, how about writing a novel? And I sort of lied and said, oh yeah, I'll get right on that, just because it's nice to think that somebody is interested. And I didn't actually think I would write a novel. I didn't think I was capable of it. And then she rang me up after the course had finished and was like, what about this novel then? So I thought I'd better give it a go. And then I wrote that novel. And she was a very clever agent and had places in her head to send it. And so it's been I've been very lucky with how smoothly the first publishing of my first book went. I've never had that urge to, get my words out there. It's much more like, if I can make a living through writing stories, that's pretty good. You know, that's something I can do and that I like. But I don't have this sort of urge to be published in that I don't think I have something to tell you all or to teach anyone or whatever. I like making stories up.
Well, I think you guys, you real, live, physically present audience members might wish to ask a question. I'm not sure if there are mics around, but if you'd like to shout it, you're very welcome. There's what, oh, sorry.
Hello, Evie. I loved your book.
Thank you.
I love the structure of the book. I thought it was fascinating, sort of unfolding all the way through to the end, which was amazing. I, like Geordie, was very intrigued by the island. I don't know, it felt so real, and so I was desperate to know where it was in England, and I was quite tortured by not being able to work out where it was. But I did read something a while ago that you spent some of your childhood in the Isle of Wight, and I wondered if you might like to say something about how that influenced your island in the book, please.
Sure, and you've kind of got the island, really. It's the centre of the Isle of Wight is still quite wild, and we've got a little bit of woodland there, my family, and so it was based on that. It's also got Parkhurst Prison, which is backs onto Parkhurst Forest, which is the prison where all of the really, really bad murderers were taken. It's not anymore because they had too many escapes. But so to me, it is quite a wild place. And the interesting thing about the Isle of Wight is all around the coast, it's all twee little tea shops and, you know, thatched cottages and stuff. And in the middle, it's quite, you know, fox and rabbit and sheep. And but it's tiny. So I think the island that Jake is on needed to be bigger. It needed a tiny bit of that tourism, but not the wealth that the Isle of Wight has. And also, I know too many people on the Isle of Wight who would kind of shake a stick and say, that's not accurate, you know, the military road doesn't pass that bit of coastway. So it basically took out the need to be too exact about a place. I like being able to take a real place and make it and structure it differently.
Great question, thank you.
Hi, Evie.
Hello.
Apart from self-doubt and being a new mum, I would like to know for you with the writing process, what is the most challenging part? Is it the first draft, second draft? What really fires you up and gets you cranky?
I think probably the first page is the hardest. I always write that last because you have to get so much information in there, and you have to do it without looking like you're getting loads of information in there. So the first chapter always takes me, 6 months on its own, because you don't want to. By that point, you know the character through writing her, and you don't want to give anything away, and yet you still want to show her as a rounded person, which is really, really hard. I think it's when I actually have to make something happen as well. It's like, rather than just sort of a feeling of dread going on, I find that very, very difficult to actually make an event occur. Hi.
My question is a little bit about process. Your denouement, or rather the big reveal of the story of origin, as we called it today, is amongst the most powerful, incredible that I've read. And, I don't want to put a spoiler in there, so without mentioning what that is, when in the process did that come to you? Was that something that ignited the story, or did you come up with it as you're writing the story about the sheep and everything? Did you come up with that later?
Do you mean the stuff that happens in the UK at the end?
No. What happened to Jake when she was a girl?
Okay. It's hard to talk about without spoilers. So and I won't completely spoil it, but if you feel strongly about it, earmuffs. But so when I was writing it, there were the bushfires in Victoria going on when I was just starting out writing this, and it just really struck me like that. Those terrible images of the cars trying to escape that got taken over, which is a very gentle, euphemistic way of putting it, and just the kind of total wipeout that these bushfires caused, and how a lot of them were started by kids who were just, they weren't necessarily massive pyromaniacs, they were just kids. They weren't thinking that they were killing people necessarily. They were just like, look what we can do. It feels like there's a sort of unthinking malevolence in setting a bushfire. And how I was thinking about how, those people who were affected by those fires in particular, the rage that they must have towards these young people, and how that would play out in a small village, in a small town. So that was really the starting point for the end. If that makes sense.
Okay. Oh, can I say you wrote that perfectly?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds like a lot of you have read the book. Can I have a show of hands? Who's actually...
Whoa.
Oh, I'm glad we kept it all quiet then. Is there, to talk about, now we all know, to talk about that kind of novel without revealing any of the plot, it's a little bit like writing a novel without the letter E. It is quite challenging. Do we have any other questions from the audience? No, I think we do. You can shout it if you like. Can I translate that for anyone who didn't hear it here or in Bathurst? The question is about the beast or creature or school children or mass murderer who is stalking Jake White's sheep. Is it real? Is it a monster? If you could resolve this now, we can all just go home.
Well, it's funny, I get a lot of emails asking that question, some of them very cross. It depends who you are. It depends who I am on particular days, what I think happened. It's sort of, what there is what's in the book. So it's sort of down to every reader, what they're bringing to it. If they have some kind of belief that there's a monster, there could be an actual monster because this is fiction and you can do what you like. But it could just as easily be Jake having what my mother would call a funny five. And the townspeople, there's a joy in writing an unreliable narrator in that you don't know how much of a threat the townspeople are. They might not be. They might be completely benign. It's just that she had this other experience that kind of brought this menace to the front of her mind. It could be something totally different. I mean, there's also on the Isle of Wight when I was a kid, there was thought to be an escaped puma, and I was really into that. I actually dressed as a puma for a lot of my childhood.
But years before onesies were a thing.
Yeah, well, it was a long time after kids stopped dressing up. So I was to just wander around the place, very much not a cat, but specifically a puma. So I had I've always been interested in the big cats that are in the British Isles. So it could they could tear a sheep apart, and then mink and foxes could come, and it could be anything.
Apparently there are a lot of wallabies in the home counties. They escape from the bestiaries of
white wallabies
of landed estates and bred with some success.
Yeah, it's really weird.
So that could be your next novel. Lady in the white blouse.
To comment on this, because I've been playing with that
Well, I think you've sort of answered it perfectly. I mean, that's exactly what I would say in response to that line. It's, you know, you shoot off in any direction, really. I think you probably have a better understanding of my book than I do. So, I mean, I think the fact that it's been sort of worming around in your head is the point, really. That you know, my book is very open-ended, and for me, if I tied everything up, if I ended everything, that's where the book finishes, and you close the book and you never think about it again. Whereas if there's something that rankles, that bothers you, and that you have to think, where does that go and how does that fit in? I feel like it kind of gives the book more of a life, and there feels to me more point in writing something that, you know, like life, we don't get closure. We just have parts of our life, and maybe Lloyd and Jake go on and have a friendship. Maybe they have an argument and he leaves the next day. But that's all there is.
On that delightfully infuriating note of ambiguity, I think we'll wrap it up. It's such a thrill to see that so many of you have read Evie's book, and you know, I don't need to tell you how wonderful it is and how wonderful it's been to have her. Many thanks, Evie.
Thank you.